And yes, this is being recorded after the teaser image for Detective Hong Lu, so if he is Tremor, then use him. Obviously, it's not really that deep. Yeah, if only you knew, Past ESGOO. If only you knew. That's right, due to popular demand and Tremor stock market manipulation, but what I can only assume is Project Moon themselves trying to get me to quit making videos, here I am once again to make a follow-up video to my last video covering Tremor, aka my most recent video, which is pretty much mandatory to have watched before this one, since I don't plan to re-talk about everything Tremor related this time around. Please God, spare me of the torture. What I will be talking about are the time-killing time event IDs and EGO, which brought in 3 new Tremor-related things to this game, and, much to my chagrin, all 3 of them are pretty goddamn relevant. So, join me as I talk about the Russian faction that will get me angry comments because I'm going to say it wrong, Hong Lu and Ryoshu, as well as Everlasting Faust, and specifically talk about their impact on the Tremor team I proposed in my last video, if they had any impact at all. Spoilers, they did. However, not all impacts are created equal. And in terms of the least impact for our purposes, Yurodivy Ryoshu, and yes, I'm going to say it wrong on purpose and use that as a shield against the YouTube comment section, but she certainly takes the cake. However, that's not to imply this Ryoshu is bad per se. If nothing else, she replaces LCCB Ryoshu as a Ryoshu with Tremor, or well, she would if LCCB Ryoshu had any relevance at all even before Eurobeat Ryoshu dropped, so it's more like LCCB has just been further cemented into her already very deep grave, much like many of her colleagues. Yurodivy Ryoshu fills a very specific niche on a Tremor team, and that is Tremor count, as in a whole lot of counts, both on herself and the enemy. Her skill 1 is actually quite abnormal outside of the standard 2 coin and 11 roll. Gaining self-tremor as a resource on use is nothing new, but gaining self-tremor based on the tremor count on the enemy is interesting, and works as a very quick way to accelerate her tremor count gain to be spent elsewhere, since this skill gives her up to 6 self-tremor count total, and inflicts a free +2 tremor count on the second hit. However, we don't care about self-tremor count until we know what its payoff is, and the main payoff you'll be seeing is on the skill 2, which gives you 2 more tremor count on use, gains clash power at 4+ tremor count similarly to the skill 1, as well as some coin power. It's worth noting that you would only need to hit the enemy when they're at 1 tremor count with the skill 1 in order to follow up with this skill and get the maximum conditionals, and needless to say, that's pretty easy. A 16 rolling skill 2 with 3 coins, specifically with a tremor count based coin power conditional, is also significant because other IDs with a similar skill have much more uncontrollable conditionals. Considering what I mentioned before, it's very easy to get tremor count from the skill 1, meaning Ryoshu has a pretty consistently good skill 2 for a 2-star ID, and to boot, its effect is, well, good, but with a bit of an asterisk. Inflicting +1 tremor count is obviously objectively good, and then the second effect takes some inspiration from Moeller Sinclair, and then does it better in almost every way. This coin will consume up to 5 tremor count on Ryoshu, and inflict an equal amount of tremor count onto the enemy. Now, that is a good effect, but this does drain away quite a lot of your self-tremor count. And while it becomes even easier to get back up via the skill 1 since you're inflicting tremor counts, it can lead to a bit of a frustrating rotation if you wanted to use the skill 2 into a skill 3, since percussive maintenance requires 8+ tremor count on self to get its coin power conditional. With 6+ tremor on the target as well, this rolls up to a 19, which is pretty nice, but that 8+ tremor count conditional is a little deceptive since you'll pretty much always have to use a skill 1 directly before a skill 3 in order to achieve it. This isn't that big of a deal, especially since the payoff is pretty nice, and this skill does contain Ryoshu's only reliable tremor burst, but speaking about tremor bursts and needing skill 1s, both of these problems can be solved with her passive. No. Oh, okay, then I guess they can't be solved. NO is a highly unique passive, especially for a 2-star ID, though thankfully it's not very complicated. This requires 3 Sloth Resonance to activate, and states that when an ally staggers an enemy with an attack, Ryoshu will go for that ASS, and follow up with a skill 1 against a staggered enemy once per turn, prioritizing the target with the least HP if there are multiple staggered enemies at once. The skill 1 used will give +1 tremor count with its effects, and triggers a tremor burst on the second hit. Now that's a lot of benefits, and 3 Sloth Resonance can be achieved pretty easily if you make some minor adjustments to your tremor team, but in most fights, this will only activate once or twice. So while it's great for a lot of reasons, like being a free tremor burst, generating a Lost Ego resource, bolstering her tremor count, and just being more damage, it isn't something that makes her a must-have in my opinion, and overall, that's kind of how Yurodivy Ryoshu feels as an ID. Her kit is certainly good enough, especially for a welfare ID that you can get basically for free. And her tremor count application is really good, so if you're lacking in that, then great. But do we really need all of that tremor count? Well, not really, and we'll talk about why that is especially true now in a little bit. The thing we really need more of, if anything, is more people to subscribe to my channel, and of course, additional self-tremor count on the IDs that need it, and in that sense, this is kind of Ryoshu's best aspect. Her support passive, which allows the first deployed ID to gain +1 more tremor count from their skills and coin effects up to 2 times per turn. Now, there's quite a few IDs that can make use of this. Basically, any self-tremor ID gets some kind of benefit, but by far the best one for our purposes is Detective Hong Lu. Okay, so before we talk about this ID properly, let me defend myself, because lots of people are saying that I am stupid and dumb for making that Tremor video before Time Killing Time, since it was so obvious that we'd be getting a Tremor Hong Lu ID after Cavernous Wailing's release. Now, I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the shrimp-shaped elephant in the room as an example of an ego lacking ID support, but there's several more examples of egos not getting IDs to support them until at least months later. So I really did have no faith in Project Moon to bless us with a Tremor-based Hong Lu ID anytime soon, but I guess that just makes me even more of an E-clown than I already was to you all, so feel free to point and laugh. Okay, pointless anger aside, yeah, this ID is good. And he continues the trend that since April of 2023, Hong Lu just can't get a bad or even really mediocre ID. His skill 1 is absolutely average, but provides some extra tremor potency as well as +4 tremor count on himself total. However, this is in 2 separate instances. You see, for the purposes of Yurodivy Ryoshu's support passive, IDs like Molar Otis, Spice Bushy Sang, and Molar Yisang get less use out of it than the other self-tremor IDs, since those 3 only ever get self-tremor on use or on discard. Whereas with Detective Hong Lu specifically, it's elementary to realize that he gains an extra +2 tremor count total from that skill 1, assuming Ryoshu's support passive is active. His skill 2 works in basically the same way, netting you either +6 self-tremor count or +8 if you have the power of Japanese camaraderie, and it can clash up to a 20 with both of these conditionals fulfilled, and both of them are very easy, which is great. Even better is that this skill is Sloth. Now, I didn't mention this with Ryoshu since I personally wouldn't field her, but if you remember in the staggering overview that you have definitely watched, Sloth generation was a concern, and Sloth has only become more important since that video, kind of, so seeing it on a skill 2 here for Hong Lu is a big relief. And a practically non-conditional tremor burst at the end of this skill that reduces count by 1 is the cherry on top of a very decent skill overall, but it's completely overshadowed by his skill 3, which is where things get a little complicated. First of all, as you might be able to tell at a glance, this skill is the reason why we want to have increased tremor count gain, since it requires a bare minimum of 10 tremor count to be useful, and a max of 15 if you want some extra power. Utilizing Ryoshu, skill 1 into skill 2 into skill 3 will mean you have 12 tremor count, accounting for the end of turn decays. Without Ryoshu, you need an extra skill 1 or skill 2, meaning your rotation is much tighter, but I digress. The skill 3 is a 4-coin, 15 rolling skill, which is about average, but it can clash up to a 29 with an attack roll of 27 total with the +3 coin power from spending 15 tremor count, though the 23 attack roll from spending only 10 tremor count is still plenty good. The biggest reason we want to spend tremor count on this skill is for the very first line, which states, if this skill consumed tremor count on use, trigger amplitude entanglement into tremor reverb. Yeah, you heard that right. While most statuses only have 1 or 2 adjacent effects related to them, Tremor now has Tremor, Tremor Burst, Tremor Amplitude, Tremor Entanglement, Tremor Reverb, Tremor Fracture, Tremor Decay, and Tremor Superposition, which is tied directly into Tremor Entanglement, and there's a Pina Colada flavored Tremor which we'll have to get to later. Regardless, Entanglement's effect works in a similar way to Tremor Amplitude, but instead of converting one tremor into another, Tremor Entanglement entangles them into one tremor, Tremor Superposition. You can think of this tremor type as the Build-A-Bear of tremor statuses, since it becomes what you make of it. For example, when you use Detective Honglu's skill 3 and activate its effect when you have regular tremor on the opponent, you inflict tremor superposition with the effects of just tremor reverb. Now take that same situation, but you activate the effect against an opponent with tremor decay. In this instance, your superposition tremor would have the effects of both decay and reverb. In addition, any tremor amplitude being used when tremor superposition is active will, instead of converting superposition tremor into anything else, would simply add on its tremor type into the superposition. For example, with our decay plus reverb entanglement, if we then used Bind's Otis, our superposition tremor would then have decay, reverb, and fracture tremor effects. The downside to this is it only lasts for one turn, since on turn end, superposition tremor is converted back to regular tremor. This means that the effectiveness of Detective Honglu's skill 3 is somewhat reliant on his speed range, since his application of tremor reverb only lasts for the rest of that turn. Of course, you still have access to Cavernous Wailing in order to have a reliable, consistent tremor reverb that won't fall off, but it's very important to keep in mind that any instance of entanglement will mean you need to reuse Cavernous Wailing to get tremor reverb back. As annoying as the reversion to regular tremor can seem, it's pretty worth it, since Honglu will burst tremor 3 times on this skill, activating reverb's effect 3 times alongside its already solid base damage. Increasing that base damage further is his passive, which gives Honglu a damage up next turn for each tremor burst he activated up to a max of 3 damage ups. This is a pretty significant damage boost to the turn after using a skill 3, so I would recommend saving a skill 2 for the turn after a skill 3 is used, so you get the best value out of it possible, though using Cavernous Wailing right after a skill 3 also makes sense to reapply the reverb tremor and, get 30% more damage on an AoE ego. Oh, and how could I forget? If you don't spend 15 tremor count on this skill 3, he'll burst tremor on himself at the end for a whopping 1 stagger threshold being raised. Yeah, I don't know why Project Moon thinks this is an appropriate downside or a downside at all, especially when Muller Sinclair already had the right idea, but I guess it's meant to imply that Honglu breaks his fucking back or something after doing this skill, because goddamn, with that upper body strength, he should really look into being a pole dancer instead of a communist. Anyways, it should go without saying, but yeah, Detective Honglu goes on our Tremor team, with no competition at all. But despite how it may seem, we aren't done. Because our Tremor team contains a Faust ID who now has the Everlasting Ego, which is just stupid. Really, that's the only way I could feasibly describe this ego. Tremor was already in a decent spot before the Time Killing Time IDs released, and I really thought all Tremor needed was a Tremor Honglu ID. But this is basically better than most anything else we could have asked for besides that. Everlasting Faust, even though her ego is based off of something called a goddamn time duck, has 4 coins. Now that's significant because, ego don't do that. Like, ever. What's even crazier is that this rolls up to a 24, which means that this is essentially a daring decision on demand, and I mean that in more ways than just the number of coins and the damage roll. Since even better than daring decision, this bursts tremor 4 times. That's not even the best part though, not even close. In the past, I have praised Effervescent Corrosion Rhodian for its good tremor count application, with some minor potency and a free burst. And while it sounds like I'm going to call it trash now, it is still good, especially for its price. But Everlasting inflicts 10 tremor potency and 10 tremor count minimum. The potency can be increased further with high enough resonance, and the count can be increased further if you have absolute sloth resonance to a max of 20 tremor potency and 20 tremor count total when you have 5 sloth absolute resonance. What the fuck? Now, really, this would be good enough. Seriously, this is all it ever needed to be a damn good Tremor Ego on its own. 4 coins, 24 roll, up to 20 tremor potency and count with 4 bursts. But, of course, we aren't done. In fact, we have another new species of tremor to add to the ever-growing bestiary. Everlasting Tremor is fucking stupid, and I love it because I get to gamble. First of all, this is the only source of it so far in the game, and it is tied to a tremor entanglement, meaning this will only ever last one turn, which is ironic, but its effect can be insanely good despite that. This gives a percentage chance for tremor burst effects to trigger again 2 times. As in, you roll the dice 2 times. One based on tremor potency and one based on tremor count, and if you hit both, your 1 tremor burst turns into 3. Through the power of holy matrimony, I guess. This is to a max of 50%, so of course your odds are never great. But let's say that your Faust ID were to be going first in a turn, and every skill following her happened to burst tremor. For a simple example, let's just say you have Detective Hong Lu, Molar Otis, and Molar Yi Sang following up after you have used Everlasting Faust Ego on an enemy that had Tremor Reverb to start. This means your Tremor Superposition has both the Reverb and Everlasting effects in it. And if you use the best skills on those IDs on that turn and hit all of your 50/50s, you would burst Tremor 36 times. And you know what? Let's not even assume that Tremor Potency is at 99. Let's assume you have 40 Tremor Potency and you hit all those triple bursts. That's 1,440 sloth damage. And we didn't even account for the average 6 sloths on our team. Now, it's obviously a lot easier to get higher tremor potency than to practically win the lottery getting all those tripled tremor bursts, but the point stands that if you set up your turns properly and get a little lucky on speed ranges and coin flips, Tremor's damage potential absolutely skyrockets. This ego is also kind of the reason I don't value European Union Ryoshu's tremor count application that highly. Sure, the ego itself reduces count within its own usage, but that's still +6 tremor count overall, and Effervescent Corrosion, or Quake Rounds, or Uvi Skill 1 can be used to supplement. Or hell, just have 3 Sloth Absolute Resonance when you use it, and then your problems are entirely gone, as you've just inflicted 16 tremor count in one skill. It really feels like the Corrosion's tremor potency and count should have been swapped with the Awakening, but I guess the lack of AoE was meant to be made up for with the tremor application, and in my opinion, yeah, more than made up for. And yeah, this Corrosion is pretty bad. I don't know why you would ever want to use it, but it's not that big a deal because the Awakening is just that damn good. Either way, the issue now becomes how do we make Faust go fast? And there's not really a great way to do that. Everlasting's ego passive will work for Regret Faust, but that requires you to use the ego at least once to set it up beforehand. Relying on RNG is fine enough, and a Tremor team isn't particularly fast, so Regret Faust's 3 to 6 speed range can have her end up as the fastest just by chance, but a valid alternative is Lobotomy Remnant Faust. If you really, really want to see Everlasting in particular do consistent work, this is a pretty alright idea due to the skill 2 making Faust easily the fastest one on the field, though for my personal tastes, I'd much rather have access to Regret Faust's innate 3 Tremor Bursts and Sloth Generation and general Tremor Synergy, but I figured Remnant was worth giving some credit to, even if just as a mention. As a last note about this ego, its cost. You really couldn't have asked for a better spread of sin affinities, because these are some of the more common sins across all the Tremor IDs, though of course this ego does add on to the sloth problem, but it is absolutely worth it because it does the job of a lot of other sloth costing ego by itself, while being kind of cheaper on sanity so long as you're winning clashes with Regret Faust, which isn't that hard considering her passive and decent overall numbers. So, at this point, you're probably wondering, ESGOO, how is it possible that you've spent almost 20 minutes on this video covering just 3 things, when the previous video was 35 minutes for 40 things? Firstly, okay, why don't you mind your own business, goddamn? And secondly, you're probably actually wondering how Everlasting Faust affects the Tremor team, if it does at all. And, well, the team I recommended in the last video still looks pretty good to me. As I mentioned, in some ways, Sloth is more valuable now, but in some ways it's less important. and I think depending on how much ego you plan to use, LCCB Ishmael can be slotted in more comfortably over Molar Yiseng now, and if you want, Ufi Heathcliff can go too, though he's actually kind of better now since his skill 3 can be used on turns when Entanglement is active in order to get some decay value, though I admit he does fall behind the other 3 stars in terms of Tremor bursts. LCCB Ishmael's Quake Rounds is just really good to get on any Tremor team if you care about going faster and care less about clashing. Again, remember, Ufi is still your best source of reliable, high clashing values. If you ask me, either of these variants look good, with the LCCB Ishmael version being easily better for fights where you don't care about ego, and the Molar Yiseng version probably being better in fights/content where you want to use quite a bit of ego. Other than that, almost every other point I made in the previous video applies. And while these two are certainly quite game-changing for Tremor, and Ryoshu is very unique, the real question is, and it's one I asked at the very beginning of all this, is Tremor good? Well, in short, yeah, it already was, but now it's pretty hard to call Tremor trash in, honestly, any capacity. Well, any Tremor that's not the base version, that one kinda sucks. With the right RNG and just a little bit of setup, it's pretty easy to have cool and effective nuke turns, and Everlasting Tremor, and especially Tremor Entanglement, open up insane avenues for Tremor on the whole, since they will synergize with any other new Tremor that likes bursting, in Everlasting's case, and Entanglement will allow for basically infinite combinations of whatever wacky Tremor types Project Moon has cooking in the back, though Tremor really does not need more support at the moment since it already has a monstrous amount of ego and IDs, though it really is one of those statuses I don't think I'll be sick of seeing if it continually innovates on itself like it has so far. But that's all from me. And while I was planning to end this video ironically on the assumption that T-Corp Dawn would be Tremor, based on her trailer, I can't do that anymore. So instead of an outro, let me say something more direct. Hey, Project Moon. Hi. You fixed this bug on Capote Merceau directly after I mentioned it in the last video. So, to prove to me that you're really listening and you want to improve your game, this text on Pagod Heathcliff's counter has never worked. So if you could, fix that and put a little, less than 3 heart in the patch notes for me, that would be great. Thanks. But on that note, thank you for watching. This video ends now.